James Carter was a man of quiet strength. He had once worn the proud uniform of his country, serving far away in places filled with dust, danger, and uncertainty. People often called him a hero, but James never thought of himself that way. To him, he was just a man who had done his duty, who had carried his brothers through battles and who had survived what so many others could not. The medals tucked away in a small wooden box at the back of his closet were not reminders of pride but of pain. Each ribbon held memories of faces he would never see again. When James returned home after years of service, he hoped for peace. But life had its own way of testing him. His wife, Emily, the woman who had once been the light of his life, fell ill. She had been his anchor, the one who steadied his restless heart when nightmares came, the one who smiled at him when words failed. For a time they fought the sickness together, hand in hand. But despite every effort, the day came when Emily's laughter faded. Her hand slipped from his, and James was left with two little girls who looked at him with wide, tear-filled eyes, asking questions he could not answer. Those little girls, Lily and Grace, were twins. They were only 5 years old when Emily passed away. From that day on, James was not only their father but also their mother, their protector, and their only source of comfort. He promised Emily, in the quiet of that hospital room, that he would raise their daughters with love no matter how hard it became. And though his heart was heavy, James kept that promise with every ounce of his being. Life after Emily was not easy. James worked at a local mechanic shop, a place that smelled of oil and iron. His hands, already scarred from the war, grew rougher with grease and hard labor. He often worked late into the evening, fixing broken engines and patching up cars that most people had already given up on. The pay was modest, barely enough to cover rent, food, and school supplies for the twins. Still, James never complained. Every night, tired and sore, he would come home to find Lily and Grace waiting by the window, their small faces lighting up as soon as they saw him walking up the path. "Daddy's home," they would shout in unison, running to the door with their arms wide open. And no matter how exhausted James was, he always knelt down to scoop them into his arms. For those few minutes, as they giggled and wrapped their tiny arms around his neck, the weight of the world seemed lighter. The Carter home was not large or grand. It was a modest wooden house with peeling paint, a squeaky front door, and a small backyard where the twins often played. The kitchen table had scratches from years of use. The sofa was old and worn, and sometimes the roof leaked when it rained too hard. But for Lily and Grace, it was home, filled with warmth because their father's love filled every corner. James made sure to wake up early each morning, packing simple lunches for the twins before walking them to school. He tied their shoelaces, braided their hair, though not always neatly, and kissed their foreheads before sending them off with a smile. On weekends, when he had a few extra dollars, he would surprise them with ice cream from the corner shop or take them to the park, where the swings squeaked as the girls laughed and soared toward the sky. He was not perfect. There were nights when bills piled up on the table, when James sat in silence after the girls went to bed, staring at the numbers he could not make work. There were mornings when the car broke down, forcing him to walk miles to work after dropping the twins off at school. And there were moments when loneliness crept in, reminding him of the empty chair at the table where Emily once sat. Yet through every hardship, James never let his daughters feel the burden. He carried it alone, choosing to shield them with his smile even when his heart ached. The twins, though young, understood more than James realized. They saw the tired look in his eyes after long days, the way he sometimes rubbed his temples when he thought they weren't watching, the sighs he tried to hide. But instead of complaining, Lily and Grace made it their mission to bring light back into their father's life. They drew pictures for him, crayon drawings of their little family, stick figures holding hands under bright suns and rainbows. They placed the drawings on the fridge so he would see them every morning. They learned to make small jokes, to dance around the living room, to sing silly songs, all just to hear him laugh. And when James did laugh, deep, genuine laughter that shook away the heaviness for a moment, the twins felt as though the whole world had turned brighter. At night, after stories and goodnight kisses, James would often sit by the window with a cup of black coffee. The street outside was quiet, lit only by a flickering street lamp. He thought about his past, about the life he once imagined with Emily, and about the uncertain future that stretched ahead. Could he really do this alone? Could he give his girls the life they deserved? The questions haunted him, but every time he peeked into the bedroom where Lily and Grace slept side by side, their tiny hands clasped together even in dreams, he found his answer. Yes, he had to. He would fight every battle, no matter how hard for them. One chilly autumn evening, the twins sat at the kitchen table, their heads bent over papers and crayons. James was busy fixing a loose cupboard door, not paying much attention. But Lily and Grace whispered to each other, their eyes filled with determination. They wanted to do something for their father, something bigger than drawings or songs. In their young hearts, they felt the weight of his unspoken struggles, and they dreamed of finding a way to help. What they didn't know, and what James could never have imagined, was that the simple idea forming in their little minds that night would change their lives forever. Part 1 closes with James unaware of what his daughters were planning. He only knew that despite every hardship, his greatest blessing was right there in front of him. 2 little girls with hearts big enough to heal, wounds even he didn't understand. James Carter had always believed that children carried a kind of magic in their hearts, a magic that could turn even the darkest day into light. What he did not know was that this magic was about to shape the future in a way he could never imagine. It started on a quiet evening, when the leaves outside rustled with the crisp breath of autumn. James had just returned from work, his shoulders heavy with exhaustion. His boots were covered in dust from the mechanic's shop, and his hands smelled faintly of oil no matter how many times he washed them. He smiled when Lily and Grace ran to greet him, their little feet pattering against the wooden floor. "Daddy, you're home," they said together, their voices bright like morning bells. He bent down to hug them, pressing his rough cheek against their soft hair. For a few moments the tiredness slipped away. After dinner, just a simple meal of bread, soup, and apples, James went to fix the squeaky cupboard door in the kitchen. The twins stayed at the table, crayons scattered around them like a burst of color against the plain brown wood. Lily leaned closer to her sister, whispering so their father wouldn't hear. "Grace, I think we should do something big for Daddy. He's always so tired." Grace nodded, her eyes thoughtful. "Yes, he works so hard, and sometimes I see him looking sad when he thinks we're sleeping." They both grew quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that belongs to children who are trying to carry something bigger than themselves. Then Lily suddenly brightened. She remembered the magazine she had seen at school in the library. On the cover was the face of a man they had read about in class, a very rich man named Edward Hale. The teacher had explained how Edward gave money to hospitals, schools, and charities. "What if we write to him?" Lily suggested, her voice trembling with excitement. "Maybe he can help Daddy. Maybe he can make Daddy smile again." Grace's eyes widened. "Do you think he will listen to us?" Lily nodded with the certainty only children could have. "Yes, because we're twins, and twins are special." That night, while James hummed softly in the other room, trying to repair an old lamp, the girls began their mission. They pulled out a fresh sheet of paper, smooth and white, and placed it between them. Grace picked up a blue crayon while Lily chose red. Together, they began to write, slowly shaping the words they knew. Their spelling wasn't perfect. Their lines were crooked, but their hearts poured into every word. The letter read, "Dear Mr. Hale, our names are Lily and Grace. We are twins, and we are 7 years old. Our daddy is a hero. He was a soldier, and now he works very hard to take care of us. But sometimes he looks very tired and very sad. We don't want him to be sad. He never buys anything for himself because he spends everything on us. He is the best daddy in the world. Can you please help him smile again? Love, Lily and Grace." At the bottom of the page, they drew 3 stick figures, 2 little girls and 1 tall man, with their hands joined under a rainbow. Above it, they wrote in shaky letters, "Family forever." When they finished, they looked at their creation with pride. Grace clapped her hands quietly. "This will make Daddy happy." But Lily shook her head. "No, we can't tell Daddy. It has to be a surprise." And so they folded the letter carefully and slipped it into an envelope. The next morning, while James walked them to school, they sneaked into the post office nearby and dropped the letter into the red mailbox. Their hearts pounded with excitement as the envelope disappeared inside. To them, it felt like sending a wish into the sky. Days passed. James continued his routine of working long hours and caring for the twins. He noticed the secretive smiles between them, the way they whispered at night before bed, but he didn't ask. He assumed they were just sharing stories or planning little games. He had no idea that their small hands had set something in motion beyond his imagination. Meanwhile, in a tall glass building far away, Edward Hale sat in his office surrounded by silence. He was a man who owned companies, properties, and wealth beyond measure. People admired him, envied him, and wrote about him in magazines. But behind the polished walls of his success, Edward carried his own loneliness. His wife and young son had died years ago in a tragic accident, and no amount of money could fill that emptiness. He lived in a grand house with chandeliers and marble floors, yet the rooms echoed with silence. Edward received hundreds of letters every week, requests for money, proposals for business, invitations to events. Most of them never reached his eyes. His assistants sorted them, replying politely or discarding the rest. But one morning, as his secretary carried a stack of envelopes, something slipped and fell. An envelope covered in bright crayon drawings landed at Edward's feet. He bent down to pick it up, his fingers brushing the childish rainbow on the corner. Something stirred in his chest, a feeling he hadn't known in years. Instead of handing it back, he opened it. The words inside were simple, spelled with the innocence of children. But as Edward read them, his throat tightened. He could almost hear the little voices behind the letter, see the small hands that had worked so carefully to write it. He paused when he reached the line. "We don't want him to be sad." Edward leaned back in his chair, staring at the stick figures drawn at the bottom. For a moment, he was no longer in his office, but in the past, remembering his own son's laughter, the way tiny hands once reached for his. The pain of loss returned, sharp but mixed with something new, a spark of hope, perhaps. He folded the letter gently and placed it on his desk, away from the other papers. "Find out who wrote this," he told his secretary, his voice quieter than usual. Back in the small wooden house, James had no idea what was happening far away. He tucked the twins into bed each night, telling them stories of bravery and kindness. The girls held onto their secret with excitement, whispering under the covers. "Do you think he read our letter?" Grace asked. "I know he did," Lily replied with certainty. "And I think he's coming." James would peek into their room, smiling at their giggles, never knowing the truth behind them. To him, they were simply children with big imaginations. To them, they were soldiers of hope, fighting to bring back their father's smile. As autumn deepened, the winds carried change. The twins could feel it even if they couldn't explain it. Somewhere in the city, Edward Hale was making a decision. The letter, so small and simple, had touched something deep within him. He had spent years building walls around his heart. But the words of Lily and Grace slipped through like sunlight through cracks. He decided he would meet them. And so, Part 2 ends with two worlds slowly moving toward each other, one of a tired father and his hopeful daughters, and the other of a lonely billionaire, whose heart had just been awakened by a letter of pure love. Edward Hale was a man the world admired from a distance but never truly knew. Newspapers called him the genius of business, and magazines printed his picture with titles like The Nation's Brightest Mind or The Billionaire Who Built an Empire. People whispered about his wealth, his charities, and his power, but very few had ever spoken to him face to face. Behind all the glamour, however, Edward lived in silence. His mansion was beautiful but empty. Its long marble hallways echoed with footsteps but never with laughter. He had cars that gleamed under bright lights, paintings that hung on golden walls, and a staff that moved with quiet respect. Yet when he returned home each night, there was no one waiting by the window, no one to shout, "Daddy's home," like Lily and Grace did for James. Edward had once been a family man. Years ago, his wife Anna and their little boy Michael had been his world. He remembered evenings when Anna would hum lullabies while rocking Michael to sleep, and mornings when the sound of his son's laughter filled their small garden. Those were the days when Edward's heart was full, even though his pockets were not. But life, cruel in its timing, took both Anna and Michael in a car accident. Since that day, Edward had buried himself in work, building walls of money around a heart that was broken and lonely. When the letter from Lily and Grace landed on his desk, it was like a stone thrown into still water. For the first time in years, something stirred. He read the letter again and again. Each word seemed to carry a weight beyond the innocence of a child's handwriting. "Our daddy is a hero. We don't want him to be sad. He is the best daddy in the world. The simplicity of those sentences hit him harder than any speech he had ever heard. The rainbow drawing at the bottom with 3 stick figures holding hands made his throat tighten. It reminded him of the drawings Michael used to give him, drawings that were still hidden in a drawer in his mansion, untouched for years. Edward leaned back in his chair, staring out of the tall glass window of his office. The city stretched far below, full of noise and people, yet in that moment, all he could think of was a small wooden house somewhere, with a veteran father and 2 little girls who believed in miracles enough to write to a stranger. Edward's secretary, a woman named Clara, noticed the unusual silence in the room. She had worked for him for over 10 years and rarely saw him moved by anything personal. "Sir, would you like me to file that letter with the others?" she asked gently. Edward shook his head. "No, this one is different. Find them. Find James Carter and his daughters." Clara hesitated. "Are you sure, sir? There are hundreds of requests every month." "Yes," Edward said firmly, his eyes still fixed on the rainbow drawing. "Most people write asking for money. These girls wrote asking for their father's happiness. That is rare. Very rare. The search did not take long. James Carter's name was known in certain circles. He was a veteran, after all, though he never spoke much about it. His mechanic's shop was listed in the small-town records, and Clara soon returned with details about his life. She placed the file on Edward's desk. Edward opened it and read about James, his military service, his medals, his wife's passing, his current job at the mechanic's shop. There was even a small photograph attached, a picture of James in uniform, younger and full of fire. Next to it was another photo taken more recently, of James standing outside his shop, his hands stained with grease, his eyes tired but steady. For a long moment, Edward said nothing. He touched the photo of James as if trying to feel the weight of the man's struggle through the paper. Then he looked back at the letter, imagining Lily and Grace's small fingers clutching the crayon. Something inside him whispered, "You have to meet them." Meanwhile, back in the little wooden house, James continued his daily routine, unaware that his daughter's letter had reached the heart of a billionaire. He worked long hours, coming home with sore muscles, but never failed to read bedtime stories or make silly faces to make the twins laugh. He still carried his worries quietly, hiding them from Lily and Grace. The twins, however, whispered to each other every night. "Do you think he got our letter?" Grace asked one evening, her small hand clutching her sister's under the blanket. "I think he did," Lily replied, her voice filled with a confidence she didn't fully understand. "And I think he's going to help Daddy." They didn't know how or when, but they believed. Children always did. Edward could not shake the letter from his mind. Even during meetings, while his business partners spoke of profits and contracts, his thoughts wandered back to the twins and their father. He imagined what it would be like to walk into their home, to see their faces light up, to sit at their table and hear their laughter. For years, Edward had surrounded himself with silence, but now he longed for something else, something warm, something real. Late one night, he opened the drawer in his study, the one he had avoided for years. Inside were Michael's old drawings, crooked houses, suns with smiling faces, stick figures with wild hair. Edward held one up, his vision blurring with tears he had not allowed himself to shed in so long. Then he placed Lily and Grace's letter beside it. The 2 drawings, though years apart, spoke the same language of love and innocence. That night, Edward made a decision. He would not simply send money or gifts. He would go himself. The following week, Edward prepared for the visit. His staff was surprised. He rarely left his world of business for anything personal. Clara arranged the details quietly, respecting his unusual request for privacy. A black car was readied, simple but elegant. Edward wanted no flashing lights, no cameras, no noise. This was not about publicity, it was about connection. As the car drove toward the small town where James lived, Edward looked out of the window at the passing fields and houses. Each mile brought him closer to something he had been missing for years, though he didn't yet know exactly what. His heart beat faster than usual, not with fear but with anticipation. Back in the Carter household, life carried on as usual. James was busy fixing an old truck in the driveway, his sleeves rolled up, his forehead glistening with sweat. The twins sat on the porch, drawing with chalk on the wooden floor. They were making another rainbow, giggling as they worked. Neither James nor the twins had any idea that their lives were about to change. Somewhere down the road, a car was approaching. A car carrying a man who had been touched by their love, a man who was about to step into their story. And so part 3 ends with Edward Hale on his way, guided not by business or duty but by the simple, powerful words of 2 little girls who believed that heroes sometimes needed rescuing too. James Carter stood in his driveway with his sleeves rolled up and a wrench in his hand. The old truck before him coughed and rattled, refusing to come alive. He wiped his forehead with the back of his arm, leaving a streak of grease across his skin. The sun was beginning to sink behind the trees, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Lily and Grace sat on the porch, their little hands busy drawing flowers and rainbows with chalk. Their laughter rose above the noise of crickets, filling the air with warmth. To James, those sounds were better than any music. He glanced at them and smiled, even though his back ached and his mind carried the heavy weight of unpaid bills. Life was hard, but he told himself over and over, as long as they are smiling, I can keep going. He didn't know that at that very moment, a black car was driving slowly down his street. Inside it sat Edward Hale, the billionaire whose heart had been stirred by a letter written in crayon. Edward's eyes studied the neighborhood as the car approached. The houses were small, some with chipped paint, others with gardens cared for with love despite their age. When the car turned into James's driveway, Edward saw the twins first, 2 little girls with matching braids and bright chalk-covered hands. "Sir, are you sure about this?" asked the driver quietly. "Yes," Edward replied, his voice firm but gentle. "This is why I came." The car door opened and Edward stepped out. His tall figure and polished suit looked out of place in the modest street. James straightened slowly, his wrench still in hand, and watched the stranger approach. His first thought was that maybe this was a customer, or worse, someone delivering bad news. "Good evening," Edward said, his tone calm. James frowned slightly, confused. "Can I help you?" Before Edward could answer, Lily and Grace gasped in unison. They recognized him immediately from the magazine at school. Their little hearts skipped with excitement. "It's him," Grace whispered to Lily. Lily nodded eagerly. "It's Mr. Hale." The girls dropped their chalk and ran straight to Edward, their arms wrapping around his legs as if they had known him forever. James's eyes widened in shock. "Girls, what are you doing? You don't run up to strangers," he scolded, stepping forward quickly. But Edward knelt down to the twins' level, his polished shoes sinking slightly into the dust. His expression softened as he looked into their innocent eyes. "You must be Lily and Grace," he said gently. "I got your letter." James froze. His heart pounded as the wrench slipped from his hand and clattered onto the driveway. What did you just say?" The twins giggled, clapping their hands. "We told you, Daddy. We wrote a letter." James turned to them, bewildered. You did what?" Edward reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He held it carefully as if it were the most valuable thing he owned. Opening it, he showed James the words written in crayon, the rainbow drawing at the bottom. "I believe this belongs to you," Edward said softly. James stared at the letter, his breath caught in his chest. He recognized the uneven handwriting instantly. It was his daughter's. His face flushed with both love and embarrassment. I didn't know they wrote this," he admitted, his voice low. He looked at the girls, who stood proudly, smiling up at him. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because it was a surprise," Lily explained. "We wanted to make you happy." James rubbed his face with one greasy hand, torn between scolding them and hugging them. He finally sighed and turned back to Edward. "Mr. Hale, I don't know what to say." Edward folded the letter again and slipped it back into his pocket. "You don't need to say anything. Your daughter's already said everything." For a moment, silence filled the air, broken only by the chirping of birds and the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. James felt his throat tighten. He was not used to strangers standing in his driveway, let alone billionaires holding letters written by his children. "Would you mind if I came in?" Edward asked kindly. James hesitated. His home was modest, far from the world of suits and glass towers that Edward belonged to. But when he looked at his daughter's eager faces, he nodded. "Of course, please. Come in." Inside, the Carter home smelled of warm soup and the faint sweetness of apples. The furniture was old but clean, the walls decorated with the twins' colorful drawings. Edward stepped carefully inside, his sharp eyes taking in every detail, not with judgment but with quiet respect. The twins quickly pulled out chairs at the wooden table. "Sit here, Mr. Hale," they insisted. Edward smiled and sat down, placing his hands on the table. James set aside his own discomfort and joined them, his rough hands contrasting sharply with Edward's polished ones. "So," James began cautiously, "you really came all this way? Because of a letter?" Edward nodded. "Yes, I've received thousands of letters in my life. Most ask for money, for gifts, for help with business. But this letter was different. Your daughters didn't ask for themselves. They asked for you." James's chest tightened and he looked down at the table, trying to blink back the emotion building in his eyes. "They shouldn't have bothered you. We manage." "It's not easy, but we manage." Edward's voice softened. "James, I didn't come here out of pity. I came because your daughters reminded me of something I had forgotten. The importance of family, of love. You've given them both, even with so little. That is something money cannot buy." The twins listened quietly, their little hands folded on the table. They didn't fully understand all the words, but they knew something important was happening. Grace suddenly asked, "Mr. Hale, are you going to help our daddy smile?" Edward turned to her, his eyes warm. "Yes, Grace. I will do everything I can to help your daddy smile." James leaned back in his chair, his heart torn between pride and humility. He had fought battles on foreign soil, but nothing compared to the battle of raising 2 children alone. And now here was a man offering help, not with pity but with genuine care. That evening, James cooked a simple meal of rice and stew. He apologized for it being plain, but Edward assured him it was one of the best meals he had ever shared. They talked for hours about the army, about business, about childhood memories. The twins filled the spaces with their laughter, showing Edward their drawings, their dolls, even their chalk-stained hands. For Edward, it was the first time in years that he felt like part of a family. The small wooden house with its scratch table and flickering lamp felt warmer than his entire mansion. When it grew late, Edward stood to leave. The twins clung to his legs. "Please come back, Mr. Hale," they begged. He knelt down and kissed the tops of their heads gently. "I promise I will." James walked him to the door, his voice thick with unspoken gratitude. "Mr. Hale, I don't know why you chose to answer their letter, but thank you, truly." Edward smiled faintly. "Perhaps it wasn't I who chose. Perhaps it was meant to be." As the black car drove away, James stood in the doorway with his daughters hugging his legs. The night air was cool, but his heart was strangely warm. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he felt that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't carrying the weight alone anymore. And in his mansion far away, Edward sat in silence, but it was a different silence now, one that held hope. For the first time in years, he looked forward to tomorrow. The night after Edward Hale's visit, James Carter sat by the window long after his daughters had gone to bed. The house was quiet, but James's mind was not. He replayed the evening in his thoughts. The sound of his daughters laughing with Edward, the way Edward had listened without judgment, the warmth in his eyes when he spoke of family. James had met many people in his life, soldiers, workers, neighbors, but never someone like Edward. He was a man from a different world, a world of wealth and power, yet he had walked into their little wooden house with kindness, not pride. And James could not shake the feeling that something important had just begun. The next morning, Lily and Grace bounced out of bed with excitement. "Daddy, do you think Mr. Hale will really come back?" Grace asked, her eyes sparkling. James smiled faintly as he tied their shoelaces. "I don't know, sweetheart, but he seemed like a man who keeps his promises." "He will come," Lily said with certainty. "I can feel it." James chuckled softly, ruffling her hair. Children had a way of believing in things even when adults doubted. Maybe, he thought, that was what made their world brighter. Days turned into a week, and James returned to his routine, working at the mechanic's shop, cooking simple meals, helping the girls with their homework. But deep down, a quiet hope lingered. And then, one Friday evening, as James was locking up the shop, he saw the familiar black car pull into the street. Edward stepped out, carrying not papers or gifts, but a warm smile. "Good evening, James," he said. James felt something shift inside him. "You came back." "I said I would," Edward replied simply. From that day forward, Edward became a regular visitor. He did not arrive with grand gestures or expensive presents. Instead, he came with time, with ears to listen, with stories to share, with patience for Lily and Grace's endless questions. The twins adored him. They showed him their school books, dragged him into their chalk drawings, and begged him to join in their pretend games. Edward, who had once lived in silence, found himself laughing again, real full laughter that surprised even him. James watched carefully at first, unsure of how much to trust this unexpected friendship. But as the weeks passed, he saw the way Edward looked at his daughters, the way he treated them not as a duty but as a joy. Slowly, James allowed the walls around his heart to soften. One evening after dinner, Edward asked James to step outside. The night air was cool and the stars glittered faintly above. "James," Edward began, his tone thoughtful, "I've been thinking about your shop." James frowned slightly. "My shop? What about it?" "I've visited it. It's clear you have skill. You work with honesty and people trust you. But the building is small, the tools are old, and you're carrying too much alone." James shifted uncomfortably. "That's true, but it's what I can manage." Edward looked at him steadily. "What if I told you I want to help? Not by giving charity, but by investing. I want to help you build something bigger, your own business, your own future. A place where you can work with pride, where your daughters can grow up knowing their father built something lasting." James was silent for a long moment. His first instinct was to refuse. He had always lived by hard work, never asking for handouts. But Edward's eyes held no pity, only respect. "Why would you do that for me?" James finally asked. Edward's voice softened. "Because once I lost my family, and when I read your daughter's letter, I realized something. They saved me as much as they wanted to save you. Helping you is not a burden, it's a gift. For them, for you, and for me." The following months brought changes James never imagined. With Edward's support, a new garage was built on the edge of town, bright, spacious, and filled with modern tools. The sign above the door read Carter & Co. Auto Repair. James's hands still carried grease, but now they carried pride as well. He was no longer just surviving, he was building. The community noticed. Neighbors came not just for repairs, but to support the veteran who had given so much. Some brought pies, others brought stories, and soon the garage became more than a workplace. It became a gathering place. Through it all, Lily and Grace watched their father with shining eyes. "Daddy, you're smiling more," Grace said one afternoon. James knelt down, hugging her tightly. "That's because of you two. You reminded me that I'm not alone." Edward, too, changed. Though he still lived in his mansion, he spent more and more time in the little wooden house. He joined the family for dinners, attended school plays, and even learned to braid the twins' hair, with clumsy fingers but a patient heart. The silence in his life was replaced with laughter, drawings on scraps of paper, and the sound of two little voices calling, "Mr. Hale, come play." For the twins, Edward became more than a visitor. He became part of their story, part of their family. And for Edward, who had once thought his heart too broken to love again, the Carter family gave him back something he thought he had lost forever: belonging. One spring evening, the four of them sat on the porch watching the sunset. The twins were busy chasing fireflies in the yard, their laughter ringing in the air. James and Edward sat side by side, quiet but content. "You know," James said slowly, "when Emily passed away, I thought the world had ended. I didn't know how I would raise the girls alone. I didn't know if I was strong enough." "You are strong enough," Edward said firmly. "I see it every day." James looked at him, his eyes full of gratitude. "Maybe, but I also know this: I couldn't have made it this far without you. You didn't just help me build a garage. You helped me build hope again." Edward's gaze followed the twins as they twirled in the grass. "And they helped me too," he whispered. "They reminded me that family doesn't always come from blood. Sometimes it finds you in the most unexpected ways." As the sky turned purple and the stars appeared, the twins came running back, fireflies glowing in their little jars. They climbed onto their father's lap and then onto Edward's, giggling as if the world was theirs, and in that moment it was. James, the weary veteran who once feared he was failing his daughters, now sat with pride in his heart. Edward, the lonely billionaire who once believed his life was only about wealth, now sat with love in his arms. The truth was simple but powerful. The twins had led their father to a rescue he never expected, and at the same time, they had rescued a man who had everything but still felt empty. It wasn't money that saved them. It wasn't charity or power. It was love. The kind of love that children give freely. The kind that can heal scars both seen and unseen. And so the story of James, Lily, Grace, and Edward became not one of pity or wealth, but of family. A family that was built not by chance but by hope. The twins had once written in crayon, "Heroes need rescuing too." They were right. Their father had been rescued, not by a billionaire's riches but by a billionaire's heart. And Edward too had been rescued by the smallest heroes of all, two little girls who believed that even the strongest man needed someone to smile for.